So once again, we continue our study of the book of Titus. Please turn to Titus chapter 2, and we'll be beginning in verse 3 this morning. We continue the discussion of the instructions that Paul gave to Titus that he used to teach in chapter 2, various different groups of people. We studied in verse 2 his instructions for the older men. We'll be continuing this morning in Titus chapter 2, verse 3, discussing the older women, and later he discusses the younger women, the younger men, and even servants later on. So in our discussion last time about the older men, we talked about the fact that they need to be sober, need to be reverent, and temperate, and sound in faith, in love, and in patience. And now we're discussing in beginning in verse 3, the older women. So let's go ahead and read the passage again so we get the background of our understanding. Let's go ahead and read verses 1 through 5. Who'd like to read Titus chapter 2? Greg, verses 1 through 5, please.
As for you, Titus, promote the kind of living that reflects wholesome teaching. Teach the older men to exercise self-control, to be worthy of respect, and to live wisely. They must have sound faith and be filled with love and patience. Similarly, teach the older women to live in a way that honors God. They must not slander others or be heavy drinkers. Instead, they should teach others what is good. These older women must train the younger women to love their husbands and their children, to live wisely and to be pure, to work in their homes, to do good, and to be submissive to their husbands. Then they will not bring shame on the word of God.
Okay, now I'm sure you all noticed that the translation Greg uses is significantly different from what some of the others have, but did you notice, or maybe you did or didn't, in verse 1, it said wholesome teaching. Well, we've emphasized that word sound repeatedly in our study, and we'll continue throughout the book of Titus from time to time to see that word. And that's what it meant, wholesome. Doctrine or teaching that is helpful. And then verse 2, regard to the men, and now we're in verse 3, the older women. We spent a good bit of time last Wednesday night discussing what it means to be older, as used in the context. And what we tried to emphasize was simply the point that we may have a concept of older, especially some people, maybe women, don't want to be considered to be older women. And so we may think that this doesn't apply to us. However, our concept, or our society's concept of older, might be maybe when you retire, 65, 70, you're older. But I don't believe that's the Bible concept of it, and we try to emphasize the fact that elders are older men, but they don't have to be 65 or 70 or older to be qualified. Their qualification is based on particularly their family situation. So when people are old enough that their children are grown, that are old enough to become Christians, old enough to leave home and so on. Now you're talking about older people. Well, that can happen long before age 65 or 70. So the instructions given here to older men and older women may very likely apply to some of us before we may otherwise have thought. So I think it's important for us to understand that. So we try to emphasize the fact that this is a responsibility that's describing here for some of us who are older, at much earlier age than what some people might think. So we emphasized that in our study last time. Which brings us then to the discussion specifically of verse 3 this morning regarding older women. Questions or discussion anybody has before we get into the discussion for older women? All right, let's look at the things it says for older women. And once again, a lot of them are similar to some of the things we've studied before. Notice he says they're to be reverent in demeanor or in behavior. So what would we understand reverent to mean as regards the older women? Remember we studied it with regard to the men in verse 2, that they also are to be reverent. These are different words, they're not the same word in the Greek, but they're similar, obviously. Translated reverent in both cases. What does it mean for an older women to be reverent? Discussion on the idea of reverent. Karen.
Well, just a general use of the term in the Bible. Malachi 2 verse 5 says, "My covenant was with him one of life and peace, and I gave them to him that he might fear me. So he feared me and was reverent before my name." So reverence would include fearing God, doing his will.
Okay. All right? Has to do then with being, having the fear of God. We studied a good bit about fear some time ago with Trevor in this Sunday morning class. The idea not just shaking in your boots type thing, but awe, a sense of respect. Okay, so the reverence that we're talking about here is a sense of respect towards God, which shows in behavior, not just speech that we say we're reverent towards God, but the older women specifically, the way they act, to show respect and awe for who God is. Other discussion on the idea of being reverent. Yes, Andrew.
I think it's important that to understand we can't be reverent unless we understand really who God is and how awesome God is and how we compare to Him as a human being. You know, where do we fall in relationship to God? And to truly reverence God, we have to know a lot about Him and how powerful He is in comparison to ourselves.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. I think more and more as we study these passages that talk about God and who He is, at least for me, it brings us to a fuller understanding of our relationship to God, to understand who He is, His character, His wisdom, His power, His goodness, all those characteristics of God. That's why He deserves our reverence. But until we understand and appreciate who He is, we don't come to that full appreciation of how we should be respectful towards it. Other comments on the idea of being reverent? I thought I saw some other hands. Terry.
It carries with it the idea of being dignified in your manner of life, the way you approach, the way you live your life has a dignity to it that reflects on your reverence for God.
Okay, so we discussed that also, didn't we, with regard to the older men, that this reverence in attitude shows in your behavior, and that's what it says specifically with regard to the women, reverent in behavior or in demeanor. So a proper attitude towards God shows in respectful conduct towards God and respect then for His word, that we do what He says, and that leads us to be respectable. We talked about that with regard to the men. The same thing is true for the women. When women act with respect towards God, they become respectable and worthy of people's respect because they're being dignified in that sense. Okay, other comments on the older women being reverent in behavior or demeanor? Frank.
Along with what Terry had just said, is another term is holiness. To our character should reflect holiness.
Okay, and in fact, the term godliness, holiness, these terms overlap and they go together, but a person who has true respect for God is going to have a godly character. It's going to show in their holiness that they don't live like the people of the world. So all of these things go together and should show in the life of those who are, all of us really, but specifically here are older women. Okay, any other comments on reverent in behavior before we move on? All right, now the next one is then it says not slanderers. Now this is one that's we haven't discussed with regard to the men in verse 2. So let's discuss the idea of a slanderer and what it means to be guilty of slander. So we're already in the questions, by the way, we're on question number 6 where we're defining these various terms for the older women. So how would you define slander, or give us some other scriptures that helps us to understand what it means to be guilty of slander? Older women to be not slanderers. Rick.
Over in 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 13, he's talking about the women, the younger women. It says, besides they learn to be idle, wandering about from house to house, and not only idle, but also gossips and busybodies. And I believe that a lot contributes to slandering.
Okay, and the rest of the verse says saying things that they ought not. So the idea of slander relates to being gossips and busybodies. Okay, maybe we'll come back to some of those concepts as we explain this further, but other passages or other comments anybody has? Susie?
I didn't look up the passage. The word devil means the accuser, and slandering is accusing falsely. So malicious gossip can be involved in that, but it comes straight from evil.
Okay, so the word here for slanderer is diabolos in the Greek, which, as Susie pointed out, is a name for Satan, and it means an accuser. Okay, so involved in this idea is accusations, but of course the implication is that they're either not true or they're being said maliciously. Okay, other comments or other passages, Karen?
Romans 3:8, Paul says, and some say, let us do evil that good may come, as we are slanderously reported, and as some affirm that we say their condemnation is just. So Paul says they were slanderously said that, and they are condemned for it.
Okay, and again, see the concept in that these people were saying these things about Paul. First of all, they weren't true, so it's slander and saying something false about someone, but it's also being said to hurt him. It wasn't saying something false. It was nice as a compliment. It was saying something false to hurt him. Okay, so slander involves saying something untrue about somebody, or that you don't know it to be true, and especially something hurtful about them, something that's said to harm their reputation in the eyes of other people. I see some other hands. I thought I saw some other hands here. Okay, Susie.
Often the motive behind it is to appear to build oneself up. If I say something unkind or untrue about you, then supposedly it reflects good on me. It doesn't, but that can be the thinking.
Okay. Other comments? Terry.
Yeah, the idea that the verse uses previously had said to be reverent in behavior and then not this. So he's defining reverent behavior, doesn't act like that, and doesn't speak like that.
Respect for God would teach us not to speak this way. Let's spend some time on this, and if you have some other scriptures as we go, that's good too. How do you know when it's right or wrong to say something about somebody that's unfavorable about them? Is it always wrong to say that somebody's bad in some way? Say that somebody's done something wrong, or that they're evil even? Is it always wrong to do that, Greg?
Well, if you know for a fact, I mean, if you're an eyewitness of their behavior, then I think it's...
Okay, so first place, whether you know it to be true.
Right.
Eyewitness would be one. When there's other ways, the Bible talks about testimony 2 or 3 witnesses, and so on. So there's ways to know it. So first of all, there's the danger of spreading things that you don't really know whether it's true or not, but it hurts the person. That's a danger with regard to slander. If you know it's not true and you say it anyway, then certainly that's slander. But even just, you're not sure whether it's true, but you say it anyway. That's the idea of busybodies. Going back to the passage in 1 Timothy chapter 5, some people just like spreading dirt. They just enjoy telling nasty things about other people. And I'm sure those of you who've had jobs in the workplace, it doesn't take you long until you know that goes on a lot in a lot of workplaces. It certainly goes on a lot in government and other places, and sometimes it goes on a lot in the church if we're not careful. Okay, so first of all, there's the consider whether or not it's true. But what else is involved in whether or not we should say something, or should we, about somebody else we're saying something unfavorable about them? What else is to be considered? Anything else?
Is it necessary to be giving that information? Sometimes there are things that you know to be true, but there may be a very select few that really need to know that information. You don't need to tell everybody, and if you're doing it in such a way to address an action or situation that you can see is harmful to their Christian well-being, you have an obligation to tell the people that it directly affects. But you really don't have to tell or need to tell just everybody because you know.
Okay. Abby has, I think, also said something very significant on the purpose or the value of what we're saying. But I want to back up and then come back to what Abby said. How do you know that sometimes it's okay to say things about somebody that are unfavorable? We're assuming, I think, from the discussion that there are times when that's proper. How do you know that there are times when it's proper to say things about other people that are unfavorable about them? Okay.
All the prophets did it, all the apostles, Jesus did it for their good.
Okay. Bible example shows us. And we studied that not long ago. There are many times when it's necessary to point out the errors of other people, not to hurt them, but to help either them or other people. And so you have Old Testament prophets, you have Jesus, you have the apostles, you have, again, examples of Jesus talked, for example, about the scribes and Pharisees at times when they weren't even there. Sometimes people say, well, it's okay if you say it to their face. Jesus said things about people unfavorable when they weren't there. In fact, whenever you read the Bible and it talks about somebody's sins, they're not there, but here it is in the Bible. So there are times when it's proper to say things about people that are describing things that are bad about them, even sins they've committed. They may not even be there. There are times when that's proper. But there's also times when it's not proper. Okay, now I want to come back to Abby's point, but I thought I saw some other hands. Did I see some other hands? That's great.
I think another distinction that needs to be made, if someone does wrong to you personally, and let's say they're a member of the church, Jesus taught us in Matthew chapter 18 the procedure of what to follow. You go to that person directly first in private. You don't bring it up with other people. That's what he taught us. And only if they won't listen to you, then you bring it up to others, their behavior toward you.
Okay, so specifically, we have guidelines if somebody's done something wrong to us, of how to handle that. And that there's a procedure, and you don't just go spreading, and that's what often happens is somebody's done something that we think is bad or wrong, and even if it's true, we know they already did it. The reaction is to spread it. Tell it, you know what so-and-so did? Why? So-and-so said such and such. But Matthew 18 says you talk to that person first, before you, and maybe hopefully that's the end of it. You can resolve it right there. It doesn't have to go any further. It goes further only if there is some important purpose, and I'll come back to Abby's comment on that. What is the purpose for what we're saying? Sometimes there's a good purpose, a good reason, but a lot of times there's not. What's the reason why we're doing it? Rick?
To save their soul.
Okay, number one, it may be to help them. If they're wrong, they need to learn the truth, and we speak to them to help them. But might be some other good reasons for saying something. When Jesus talked about the scribes and Pharisees in Matthew 23, if you read the context, he said some terrible things about them, and they weren't there. Read the context. So he wasn't doing it for their benefit necessarily. Why was he doing it then? Terry?
Well, sometimes it's to warn somebody of the danger of dealing with that person.
Okay, so sometimes there are other people who need to be warned. They may be in danger because of the influence or the things being done or said by this other person. Okay, so there's a lot of things to consider. It's not just a question of it's wrong to say anything bad about other people, so as some people sometimes think, or even that it's always bad to say something wrong about somebody who's not there. That's not necessarily true either. But it could come down to, first of all, Greg's point, is it true? But secondly, what's the motive? Are you saying it for good, you have a good purpose, or are you saying it to harm somebody? And some things are confidential, and there's nothing to be gained by saying them. So to reveal something that's confidential is also a consideration. All right, other comments, Terry?
Sometimes we end up participating in this kind of just talk to validate ourselves. And that's a dangerous thing to be doing.
Okay, and I think that goes along with Susie's point earlier. It's to try to make ourselves look bigger or better by hurting other people. It's not necessarily that we care about the other person. It's just that we want to make ourselves built up. I want to look at Ephesians chapter 4 with you, please. And let's see, I'm looking at verse 31. Let's see. Let's start with 29. We'd like to read Ephesians 4. Let's read verse 29 and 31. Ephesians 4, verse 29 and verse 31. We'd like to read that for us, please. Steve, please. Chapter 4, verse 29 and 31.
Let no corrupt communication proceed out of your mouth, that which is good to the use of edifying, that it may minister grace unto the hearers. And grieve not the Holy Spirit of God, whereby ye are sealed unto the day of redemption. Let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and evil speaking be put away from you with all malice.
All right, now verse 29 and verse 31 both talk about speech, corrupt speech, evil speech, and so on, and give, I think, some very important principles we've already been discussing. What do you see in verse 29 and or verse 31? It helps us to know when we should say something, even if it's saying something that somebody did wrong. What do you see that it helps you to know whether or not it's proper to say it? What do you see in those verses? Well,
If it's edifying.
does it edify? Edify means what? Build up. So in other words, if you say this, is somebody going to be helped by it? And are you saying it for that purpose? Okay, and that goes back to a lot of your comments and so on. What good is going to come from saying this? Is it going to benefit the person that I'm saying it about, or other people who need to be warned about a situation? Is it going to edify? Is it going to build up? Okay? What else do you see in those verses that helps us to know whether we should say a thing or not? Anything else? Or other comments on that? All right, what about verse 31? Now, there's various terms here in verse 31, but there's evil speaking. But what does he say else, in addition to that, that helps us to know when it's evil speaking? What else is it associated with? Terry?
Malice.
Malice. Malice means what? Malice is you're malicious in your intent. That means what? You're trying to harm somebody. So it's evil speaking if you speak with intent to harm, even if what you say is true. But there's no good reason to say it, or the reason you're saying it is because you want to hurt the person. So all of these passages and these concepts, I think, go together with the idea of what constitutes slander that we need to avoid. Is it true? What's your attitude? And is there something worthwhile in saying it? And are you saying it for good or for harm? Okay, other comments anybody has on the idea of being a slanderer? I know that's a lesson important for all of us, isn't it? And many other scriptures that teach us that we should not be slanderers, talebearers, and so on. Okay, anything else before we move on? All right, that'll be not slanderers, reverent in demeanor, not slanderers, not a slave to much wine. Now, we've talked about this several times, haven't we? In regard to the elders, back in 1 Timothy 3, and again in Titus here in chapter 1, the idea of not giving them much wine. And we pointed out that the word that's used for wine is a word that sometimes is used for alcoholic beverages and sometimes it's non-alcoholic. But obviously here it's alcoholic. Why would you be enslaved to non-alcoholic wine? Comments or discussion on the idea of not giving too much wine? Comments anybody has on that one? Karen?
Well, I remember a lesson, maybe it's a series that you gave several years ago on today's wine compared to Bible times. And the fact that today's wine is much stronger, much more alcoholic than what they had then because of the process they use today. That wasn't available to them. So it's the wine that we have today is not the wine they had then.
And beyond that, we have whiskey and those kinds of alcoholic drinks they didn't even have, because the process of distilling wasn't even available, wasn't even invented until relatively recent times. So that when we talk about social drinking, as it is in our society, that is much wine. By any biblical standard, even if it's just a glass of wine, it's generally much more alcoholic than it was in Bible times. Okay? Rick?
I think a lot of it has to do with what are you drinking it for? I mean, most people drink strong drink to get drunk, to lose their inability, they want to have a part, they want to have fun, what they consider fun. Where the older men here are taught to be sober, which I believe that would go along with the women too. And they are to be teachers of good things, so you can't do both. That's like trying to serve two masters at once. You can't do it.
Okay, so the passage says, enslaved to much wine, depends on your translation, may sound like alcoholic or addiction, or at least drunkenness, but as we pointed out with regard to the elders, to rebuke an extreme doesn't justify a lesser extreme. The fact that it may not be addiction or even drunkenness doesn't necessarily make it right, because there's many other scriptures and other principles to be considered. And I think Rick's pointing, again, so much of what we see in our society of alcoholic drink is, as he pointed out, they think if you get a little bit high, you have a good time, or there are people that are just trying to drown their sorrows, as they say, trying to forget the problems that they think they've got by causing more problems for themselves, really, or just to be sociable. All of those, but what results from it is, as Rick also pointed out, a lack of sobriety. And that word sober, we're going to see it again and again, as we pointed out, with regard to men. Our alcoholic drinks today have that effect. You lose the ability to have good judgment, to discern good from wrong, right from wrong. And so Christians should simply avoid them as the application for today. Did I see another hand? Terry.
Well, taking in an intoxicant affects your behavior. And like you said, your thinking. So reverent behavior is behavior that's completely in control of itself. And you lose that ability to control your tongue, maybe. Maybe it doesn't affect your driving, but it's certainly going to affect your tongue. And the things that you're willing to do and laugh at and be involved with. So it's definitely not a license for social drinking.
Okay, so the behavior and the speech we've already talked about. All of those are affected by the use of alcoholic beverages. And we talked about 1 Peter 5 and verse 8 in an earlier discussion, how that the devil is a roaring lion, and so we should be watchful and sober, watching carefully for the temptations that he might bring, and having strong convictions to resist. Well, alcohol is the first thing it does, the very first thing alcohol does, is to weaken those inhibitions and that ability to resist error. All right. Other comments before we move on? Debbie.
Well, Paul tells Timothy to take a little wine for his stomach's sake. So older people sometimes take wine as medicine back then, and medicine today has alcohol in it.
Okay. So to say that a person has drunk something with some alcohol in it is actually sinful, again, it goes back to the point, the purpose of it. But on the one hand, we all, if you think about it, we know the difference between a medicinal purpose and a social purpose, or simply for the enjoyment of a beverage. We understand that there are some medicines that you take because the doctor prescribed them, or you're taking it to heal some physical ailment that you have that you wouldn't otherwise take. Okay, so yes, sometimes there may be some purpose for taking something that has alcohol in it, a proper purpose, but that does not justify drinking it for the fun of it or for social purposes. There's a difference, and we know that. We understand that. Okay, anything else before we move on? Okay, let's look at the next one, the teacher's idea. And I want us to spend some time on the idea of women being teachers. What often happens, and we're looking at question number 7 in particular now, what often happens with regard to teaching is that people say, and women think sometimes to themselves, well, the men are the ones who do the preaching and they're the ones who lead the Bible studies. And so there's no teaching for me to do. That's the men do that, and there's nothing for me to do, or very little for me to do. But here's a passage that plainly says there's a role for women as teachers. So I want to spend some time on it, what the Bible says about teaching in general, and specifically about women as teachers. So what scriptures do you have that help us understand women as teachers? Passages for us to consider. Anybody? Abby?
I don't have a specific passage, but I can tell you from where I am at now, I have a daughter-in-law who was not raised in the church, and I had stellar examples of how to be a godly woman by my mother-in-law and by my grandmother and by this congregation. It isn't just teaching verbatim scriptures. It's in actions, it's in dispositions, it's in hospitality, it's in willingness to talk, willingness to explain, willingness to support and edify. Those things that as women we need to be trained, efficient, and learning the roles of a Christian in the way that supports our husbands and that brings glory to Christ and that edifies those around you, to see God's glory in just the way you live. And taking the time to have studies on harmony in the home and children rearing and things that instill in you godly principles that you show every day.
Okay, so that verse 4 continues, doesn't it? That they admonish the young women to do the things that young women are supposed to do. So the very context shows that one of the main roles of women as teachers is teaching other women, both by their words and instruction from Scripture and by their example. That's one primary area, and which obviously we're going to spend some time on when we get to verse 4. But other passages or discussion on women as teachers. Terry?
In Acts 18, verse 26, it's talking about when Apollos came to Ephesus and Aquila and Priscilla were there. He was preaching and teaching, but he did not teach accurately the things of the baptism of Jesus. So he began to speak boldly in the synagogue, but when Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they took him aside and explained to him the way of God more accurately.
Okay. Now notice here we have an example in which a woman actually helped instruct a man in the truth. Now, did she stand up in the church assembly and preach? No, he took him aside. And did she teach authoritatively over the man? Said, now you listen to me. What you're doing is wrong, and I'm going to tell you what to do. Did she use an authoritative approach? No. She was working with her husband. Okay, so there's subjection in her efforts. But nevertheless, she even helped a man to learn the truth. Women have a responsibility, which we studied in 1 Timothy chapter 2, not to exercise authority over men. And we have studied other passages. In fact, Darrell just had a sermon on 1 Corinthians 14 and so on, that's not in the church assembled, when the whole church is assembled together. Nevertheless, there is a role for women in helping men, even men. We've learned the young women here in the context, but even men, they can, under certain circumstances, if they do so respectfully, help a men to learn the truth. Okay? Other comments on women as teachers? Karen.
A couple of verses that are connected. 2 Timothy 1, verse 5. Paul says to Timothy, when I call to remembrance the genuine faith that is in you, which dwelt first in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice, and I am persuaded is in you also. Then over in chapter 3, verse 15, Paul says, and that from childhood you've known the Holy Scriptures. So Paul's saying, Timothy's known the Bible since he was young from his mother and grandmother.
All right. So here's another area where women have an important role as teachers, and that is teaching children. Their own children, other people's children too. But what greater good as a teacher can anyone do that would be greater than bringing up children to learn the truth and know the truth and be faithful servants of God? The role of women as teachers is not only okay, it's essential. Women need to learn to do it. God's people need women who are willing to do it. It's fundamental. They are teachers too. And the idea of leaving it up to the men misses the point of Scripture. Okay, other passages or other comments on women as teachers? Karen?
Well, lots of times you hear a lot of young people saying, well, I want to have an influence on the world. I want to do something to help change things. What greater thing can you do in life than to teach your children the Bible, to become Christians? That'll have more influence on the world than anything else.
Okay, other comments? All right, let's look at some scriptures that I had prepared for today. Just in general, these are general passages about teaching. But as we look at them, ask whether that includes women. Okay? Acts chapter 8 was the example there where the church was scattered because of the persecution of Saul of Tarsus. But the men and women were scattered, and the passage says they went everywhere teaching the word. They who? Men and women went everywhere teaching the word. Galatians 6:1. If brothers are overtaken in the fault, you who are spiritual, help such a one. Who is it that's to do that? Those who are spiritual. Is that just the men? The men the only spiritual people? 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 24 to 26, the Lord's servant must not strive, but be able to teach. Well, are women servants of the Lord? The Lord's servant must be able to teach, and to teach those who have become ensnared by the devil and so on. 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 11 talks about the brethren, who it says there in the context are to encourage and build one another up. And the word brethren obviously sounds like masculine, but it includes all Christians because it often is addressed, the scriptures are addressed to brethren. Specifically Ephesians chapter 4, every part of the body should work to build up the body. Well, women are part of the body. They should be working to edify the congregation. Hebrews chapter 3 talks about those of us who are partakers of Christ should edify one another and so that we don't fall away and so on. Well, are women partakers of Christ? Then they should be helping others to avoid falling away. Chapter 5 and verse 12, by reason of time you ought to be teachers. Not just the men, but the women as well. Chapter 10, verse 23 and 24, those who hold fast the confession should be those who are provoking one another to love and good works. Well, do Christian women hold fast the confession? Then they should be provoking others to love and good works. 1 Peter 3 and verse 5, sanctify the word of God in your hearts and be ready to give a defense to those who ask you. Well, should Christian women sanctify the Lord in their hearts? If so, they should be ready to give a defense to others. And those who partake of the common salvation, he says in Jude 3, should be defenders of the faith. So without mentioning specifically women, I believe there are many scriptures that show women have a responsibility, not just the opportunity, a responsibility to learn to teach others respectfully in their proper position, but nevertheless they have a responsibility. Now here are some passages specifically about women. Ephesians 15, Miriam was a prophetess and led the women in praise to God. The book of Ruth, you have a lot of this spiritual discussion between Ruth and Naomi, an older woman and a younger woman, discussing biblical spiritual principles between the two of them. 1 Samuel chapter 25, you've got Abigail. Abigail, respectfully, very respectfully, told David that he was about to do something that he shouldn't be doing. She counseled him to do what was right. 2 Kings chapter 22, there was a prophetess named Huldah who gave a revelation which benefited the king. Proverbs 1 and verse 8, a son should not forsake the law of his mother. Chapter 31 and verse 1, King Lemuel was taught by his mother. Chapter 31, 26, the worthy woman spoke words of wisdom. Luke chapter 1, Elizabeth and Mary, again, two women, giving edifying and teaching and admonition to one another. John chapter 4, the Samaritan woman at the well, after she learned about Jesus, went back into town and taught the people, including the men, told them about Jesus. Women often had the gift of prophecy. We talked about Acts 18, Priscilla and her husband correcting Apollos, and 2 Timothy 1, Timothy being taught by his mother and grandmother. So I hope, first of all, let me back up. I know that there are women in this congregation who understand and appreciate this concept and have been very diligent to do it. But we need to appreciate that, encourage it. And all women, as Christians, need to learn it. The younger learn it from the older, but we learn it from the scriptures. And it's very important, I think, for all of us to encourage it. Even though there are limits, yes, let's teach the limits, but let's not just teach the limits. Let's also teach the responsibilities. Other comments or discussion on women as teachers? Anybody? All right. There was one more comment that I want to make on this. After class last time, some of us had some discussion about the fact that sometimes the older women are willing and able to do this teaching, but sometimes the younger women are not interested in listening. We're going to get into the next verses here, that their responsibility to admonish the young women and some of the things that are to teach them. Teaching takes effort and willingness on both sides. The teacher needs to be willing to teach, and those who need the teaching need to be willing to listen and cooperate. That's true in all teaching. All teaching. What we're talking about right now isn't going to do any good if the teachers don't teach or if the students don't listen. It takes both. When we're trying to teach the gospel to our neighbors, so often we find they're not interested in listening. Well, our job is to offer, to do the best we can. If they won't listen, we go on to somebody else. But the same thing true for women as teachers. They're trying to teach somebody, they offer, they try to do what they can. If the person's willing to listen, teach them. If they're not willing to listen, find somebody else. But understand that it's a two-way street that involves people on both ends being willing if there's going to be effective teaching. Anything else before we go into verse 4? Anything else on the older women, and especially the being teachers of that which is good? Okay, let's move on then to the younger women. Okay? Now the younger women, first of all, the older women are to teach them. So we've already covered that fairly well now. Any other comments on the idea of the younger women being taught by the older women? Terry?
In the ESV, it uses the words in verse 4, and so train the young women. When you're in a training situation, that involves interaction, not just words. And usually, example, but actually getting into a situation where you're showing, maybe it's keeping the house, maybe it's learning to cook, so that she can care for her family. And there are things, especially in today's culture, that most young women learned at home that they're not learning at home anymore. And Abby referred to her daughter-in-law, our granddaughter-in-law, there are things that she didn't learn in the home that she's going to have to learn, and a lot of that will be example and doing with. An older woman has the opportunity to teach by inviting a younger woman into her home in a simple way as, I'm going to be canning green beans this week. Would you want to come spend some time with me? And you train them on things that they didn't know.
Okay, and so that comment, along with Abby's earlier comment, that this teaching we're talking about is not just word of mouth. It's by example, and in many cases, it's by showing. People say, well, let's do this. Or let me do it together with you. Let's do it together. And that person learns from the one who's experienced by doing what's being done together. Okay? Other comments on the older women admonishing the young women. Why are the older women specifically given this instruction? Why is it addressed specifically to the older women? We've kind of assumed that in our discussion, but why? Why not the other way around? Rick?
Experience.
All right. The instruction assumes that those who are older have learned it by their own experience and their own study. What that implies then is that women have a responsibility as they grow to learn these things. You can't teach somebody else what you don't know yourself. If you haven't learned it, you can't teach it. So the implication is that it's a responsibility. If you're not an older woman yet, you're going to be one someday. Okay? You need to be preparing for that. You'd be working so that you can be a teacher of good things and teach the young women. Okay? And it's back to Terry's point as well, before we close. Our society today so often does not understand the concepts we're about to talk about at all. Specifically the things the Bible says about young women and the roles of women in general. So much of our society has either rejected or just has neglected to the point that young women today do not understand much of what we're going to be talking about. They need this kind of teaching. It needs to be done. And there's no better people to do it than those who are the older women. Terry?
I think one of the important factors here is a young person is more soft to learning. As we age, we begin to harden in our thoughts. Not that we should, but that's what happens. We get used to the way we've always done something. It's like the simple saying, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. Well, that has some kind of basis in fact, not always true. But if we do the teaching while they're young, you have a better opportunity to make the changes in that person's attitude and actions before they harden into something that's not good, that's very hard to remember.
Okay. Anything else before we close? Rick, and then we'll conclude.
One point I'd just like to point out, you might be an older person, but you might have just been baptized. You might have just come into the church. So there might be, just because you're an older person don't mean that you know what to teach a younger person.
All right, that's why we try to emphasize the importance of growing in our knowledge and in our service to the Lord so that we can teach others. Okay, thank you very much. We'll take up in verse 4 then, Lord willing, Wednesday night, some of the specific things then that are to be taught to the young women. Thank you.